This is a chapter review for Vinland Saga 195, Thousand Year Voyage, Part 4. Last chapter, we had Ivar finally making some moves and starting to build up a group of people within the settlement who feel like defenses and preparation for war are necessary and that they must start preparing for the possible scenario of the Gitpi tribe and other new people becoming enemies of the settlement. This started with the construction of the fort, and after that, Stork essentially proposed a debate for the village to decide as a whole how they are going to, I guess, treat the new people going forward and what policies they need to take now that the Markland incident has occurred. So, based on last chapter, I expected this chapter to be a full-on debate between the pro-armament and anti-armament characters in our main cast. And I also said last time that I expected Thorfinn's side to win, but with some compromises being made that could ultimately lead to even more division. But while we do get this debate, we don't have the conclusion of the debate here, so whether or not that idea of compromise and increased division due to compromise is a factor, we'll have to see. But still, as we pretty much expected, as set up in last chapter, this is going to be our full-on debate. But there is part of this chapter that I did not expect, and we're already going to start with it here, and that's the involvement of Cordelia and how she plays a role in this chapter. Parts of it I probably should have seen coming, but this is some exciting stuff, so let's just get right into it. So, before we reach the cover page here, we begin with a glimpse of Cordelia's past, and we see Thorkel here at the top, looking down, saying, "You were born as a man after all, Halvor." And Halvor is Cordelia's birth-given name, and as we know, Cordelia was born a man and has undergone a sort of transition to presenting as female and taking on female pronouns and female, generally feminine roles, traditionally feminine, rather. So, well, we see Thorkel here, and I don't believe this is an actual event from Cordelia's past, because I don't think Thorkel is supposed to be aware of Cordelia's birth sex, because Cordelia's mother told him that she was a girl, and that's why Thorkel got Cordelia a husband and all that. So it is either that this is sort of almost shortly after Cordelia's birth, where Thorkel is already assuming Cordelia to be a boy, and that's why he's saying this, and he's not confused, because we can also see here Thorkel doesn't have the eye patch yet. So this isn't after Thorkel brings a husband for Cordelia. So a little bit of a weird thing here. So it could either be before Thorkel learns that Cordelia is female, or before he is told, and then it could also just be a visual representation of Cordelia's internal conflict. So, a lot to talk about with just this first panel, but below this, we could see a battlefield from Cordelia's perspective, and this is really interesting. This tells us a couple things. So one, clearly, Cordelia has fought on a battlefield before. Cordelia has seen war firsthand, and I did not expect that. This is kind of surprising to me. This also shows that Halfdan is not the only person she has been owned by as a slave. Halfdan has not been her only master, I guess. So that's really interesting to me. I for some reason assumed Halfdan was the first. So it's interesting that this kind of almost shows that Cordelia has been sold around a bit. And due to her build, that's, I guess, not too surprising. Especially if she ends up not fighting, as we could see here. Because she's being chastised by her kind of compatriots here, the other men kind of fighting alongside her, for not having enough fighting spirit and wasting her body. And sort of just setting up, like, Cordelia being pushed into masculine societal standards. But below this we see Ivar, and this is from Cordelia's perspective when she first found the sword, and Ivar and Stork try to keep her quiet and manipulate her a bit. And we're seeing Ivar again from her perspective in that during that event. And then next page we see a sort of faceless glimpse, I guess, of Cordelia's mother, reassuring her that she will find a place where she can be herself. And all of this sets up immediately that Cordelia will have a significant role in this chapter, and that's very exciting because obviously Cordelia has some very key information. She is the only person outside of Ivar's sort of gang that is aware of the sword. And immediately this is telling us something big is going to happen here. But then we see Thorfinn introducing the topic of the thing, the debate rather, which is whether or not the village must arm themselves. And this leads us to the cover page. Again, chapter 195, 1000-Year Voyage, part 4. And I just want to say, this is a really nice cover page. I love this. We have Arnheid's statue all the way in the back, sort of looking over the debate. And this is really cool, because it's sort of like she's looking over and judging them, whether or not they are living up to her ideals and what she represents and the promise that Thorfinn and Einar made at the grave. So I love the use of the statue here just to kind of call attention back to Arnheid, back to her story, back to her struggle. So the debate is sort of split into two parties here, with Thorfinn and Ivar representing them. And Ivar begins just by bluntly saying that weapons are necessary and that everyone must be thinking the same. And he believes that it's just pointless to make a whole big debate out of it, because in his mind it's very straightforward, it's very simple. Weapons are necessary to avoid war. That's his point. Hild addresses Thorfinn kind of immediately as he sits down, and she's encouraging him to debate more aggressively and really push his opinions rather than kind of listening and hearing everybody out and letting everybody talk, because Hild can see that the more these guys talk, the more they're going to play into the fear-mongering, the paranoia, and especially in Stork's case, the more they're going to be able to manipulate everybody in the settlement. So like last chapter, we see, again, Hild's strengths and how she complements Thorfinn's weaknesses, especially on the debate stage here, with her very, very blunt, very kind of aggressive, very opinionated demeanor. And still, though, Thorfinn tells her that he genuinely wants to have this discussion here, and he wants to like really explain his perspective to the settlers so he can convince them rather than forcing his opinions onto them. And that's just, you know, very straightforward Thorfinn characterization. He believes in what he's saying, and he wants to convince everybody rather than rule with an iron fist here and demand what should be done here. But we can see here that Einar lets Thorfinn know that Bug Eyes is coming, and this obviously is going to make sense later if you read the chapter, but when I read this, I was like, okay, Bug Eyes is coming. So, like, I didn't even think about what that would really mean. So, I think that's just a cute little hint and foreshadowing for the end of the chapter. But Hild continues to Thorfinn here, asking what he will do if the settlers still choose to arm themselves. And then we have Gudrid step in, and she's telling Hild that it'll be okay, because all the women support peace. But Hild isn't really comforted by this, though, because she says the men outnumber the women 3-1. But going back to Gudrid here real quick, it's cool that Gudrid is inserting herself here as the sort of strong voice for the women. She's representing women who want change. Considering her arc, this is a very perfect role for her. I'm excited to sort of get more into the role she plays here, because I absolutely love Gudrid in this chapter. But now Ivar begins his initial argument. He explains that good relations between the settlers and the Ulnu cannot be guaranteed. He says that from their perspective, the settlers are invaders. And we saw in, I believe, chapter 193, with the reaction of the Ulnu and the reaction specifically of the shaman, that this is exactly what he's saying, that they are invaders. And he continues saying that because of the success of the village, they will only continue to grow and take more land. So he's almost acknowledging that they are invaders, that they are taking their land. He doesn't see it as land that is sort of free and, you know, not necessarily theirs, but just kind of nature that they are allowed to take. He genuinely sees this as the new land. Or he at least is able to acknowledge the perspective of the Ulnu that this could be their land. And he's almost saying that they're not necessarily wrong to see them as invaders because of what they're doing. And he believes that ultimately they must see this now. And for that reason, they need to start preparing for an attack, for war. And we can see general response to this argument from Ivar is not very positive, since the Ulnu haven't really shown any signs of aggression for the settlers specifically. They're not thinking about Markland, they're thinking about how have the Gippy tribe treated them, and all we have seen is friendly relations with no real tension. Besides, of course, from Ivar, and whenever Ivar acts a little bit unreasonable. But we have Uggi detracting from this, saying that if he were the enemy, he would attack by surprise to catch them off guard. And Thorfinn immediately says that the Ulnu are not their enemies at this point, and they should not be treated as such. So it's good. Thorfinn immediately kind of taking that sort of paranoia down, because Mr. Uggi, again, is a very paranoid, very scared character. And it's good for Thorfinn to calmly shut that down immediately. And then we have the settlers talk amongst themselves. One says that Ivar has a point. If they don't prepare to defend, then they can't comfortably work in the fields. And another says that to avoid war, they have to be well armed. And another says that it wouldn't make sense to base their policies just on the goodwill of the Ulnu. And I think that last point isn't necessarily a bad one. Neither of these are really bad points. They're somewhat reasonable. Specifically, the comfort and the trust when creating these policies. And because the Ulnu are sort of the other, they're the outside. They're not really part of the settlement. It makes sense that they can't just guess that the Ulnu will have goodwill. So the pro-armament ideas being thrown around right now, they're not being unreasonable. But it is still beyond what Thorfinn wants to do. It doesn't align with his ideals. But now Gudrid asks to speak, and she gives her argument. which she has sort of framed as the perspective of women. She says that it's always men who start wars and refuse to listen to women, and this is, again, aligned with Arnheid, with her ideals, what she represented in her story. She asks if the men have ever considered how women actually feel when the men are at war. And she specifically asks this guy who's a father. And they all seem kind of unsure, but he takes a guess, saying, "Is it Win Daddy?" Like they're cheering him on from home, hoping he wins and brings back some riches, you know. But then Gudrid very bluntly says that they're thinking that the men should quit playing around and get back to the field so they could support their families. And the men are absolutely shocked that the women would think this way while they risk their lives on the battlefield for their families. But Gudrid concludes saying that men are losing focus on what they agreed to when they joined this pioneering project, which is to create a country without slaves and war. And I'm really glad Gudrid brings this up here, because yes, they all agreed to Thorfinn's plan. He made a point to properly communicate what the plan is and what they want to do, and especially that there will be no swords in Vinland. He made this extremely clear, and everybody who came here agreed to that. So this immediately starts to cause a bit of introspection within the group. They're thinking about, you know, sort of like the promises they've made versus the fears that they've kind of built up. But we have Ivar aggressively fire back, saying that they can't avoid war without arming themselves and that women just need to stay out of it. Gudrid immediately mocks Ivar here and accuses him of just wanting to go to war to reinforce his masculine ego, and immediately Ivar starts to kind of fall back into his emotions, get angry like he usually does, but Stork kind of reels him in, once again, like Hild, showing how he complements Ivar's weaknesses, how he is able to take control of the situation. But Gudrid continues a little bit more, serious now, saying that everywhere else in the world, men are just looking for excuses for war, but regretting it when everything turns to ash. But they came to Vinland for the sake of trying something different from that, where men don't have to fight. And we can see here this kind of resonates with Cordelia. Specifically, Gudrid saying that men don't have to fight if they don't want to sort of sparks Cordelia here. But we'll talk about that later. Gudrid then uses Thorfinn as her example of a man worthy of this new society in Vinland, who doesn't give in to the pressure of masculinity and avoids conflict. And she ends this train of thought by taking another jab of Ivar here, accusing him of just liking war and looking for an excuse to start one, which again forces Stork to keep Ivar under control. But then we have Cordelia speak up, asking if men really don't need to go to war. Gudrid and Thorfinn both assure her that Vinland is all about hating war, and Thorfinn then says that she needs to stay herself, hating war like she does. Stork begins to try to take over the debate here, and starts to take the strategy that he did last chapter, where he'll take the argument being presented to him and kind of sum it up and then counterattack it and tear it down. But before he's able to sort of wrestle control here, Cordelia interrupts him and drops an absolute bomb on the conversation, revealing that Ivar brought a sword to Vinland. And this is huge. I gasped reading this. Ivar and Stork here are just shocked that she talked. Thorfinn and Hild are just kind of frozen. And Ivar is pissed. But he doesn't deny it, and he has Gangati bring out the sword. Thorfinn looks down at the sword, and he's just full of so many emotions with this face. It's shock, it's anger, it's fear, it's sadness. And Stork attempts to provide an explanation and save face, but Thorfinn now aggressively interrupts and declines any attempt at excuses. He tells Stork to hand the sword over and that he will turn it into a sickle blade instead. And this panel of Thorfinn down here is just so aggressive and imposing, and he means business, and Stork can tell. And after seeing this side to Thorfinn that he's never seen before, Stork realizes the argument's come to a head, and if this continues, Thorfinn will have the upper hand. So, instead, he sort of breaks the tension by calling for all the settlers to now pick a side before anything else could be said. He knows the argument is going to be lost, and they won't be in a good position if this continues. So he uses the tension to spark division as soon as he can. And he just uses this to boil the argument down to black and white as well. Swords or no swords. Which just abandons all ambiguity and complexity to the argument. And Hild immediately realizes how effective this tactic will be, but it's too late for her to do anything. So we have the settlers talk amongst themselves, and they're unsure of what to do. And even the children down here are told to pick a side, and they look to Hild for what to do, because she's sort of been their mentor, she's been their teacher, and they trust her. And this results, basically, in a split between our main characters of Thorfinn's party and the women of the settlement, and then, well, rather women and children, and then all the men taking Ivar's side. And Gudrid angrily says that this is unfair because there's more men, and accuses the men of just being war-loving idiots. But Stork argues back by saying it's about security and not a love of war. As he says this, we get another panel here on the right of Arnheid's statue, immediately again making us think of how disappointed she would be in this, in what Stork is saying, and how once again this idea of women being caught in the men's storms completely calls back to the pain that she endured and suffered. But Stork's main argument here is essentially that men don't like war, and that they are so afraid of it that they must arm themselves in order to feel safe. So by calling men cowards and embracing himself as a coward rather than a warmonger, Stork just completely dismantles Gudrid's main argument here, that they are war-loving idiots who want to stroke their ego. This could be true for some of them, maybe Ivar, but when it comes to what Stork is saying here, he has a good point. This is about security. They don't love war. They want to feel safe. She tries to ask, since they acknowledge that they don't love war, why can't they change and just stop fighting? And Stork responds that it's because it's the same for the Ilnu people. Their men are also cowards who are afraid of war. If they're afraid, they're going to want to be armed to protect themselves. They're going to make preemptive moves against the settlement. And Ivar comes in to co-op Stork's argument here, saying that suspicion and fear can only be counteracted by having the upper hand in military might. Thorfinn questions Ivar's idea, saying that if disputes can't be settled with talking, then that makes the thing meaningless, which is a very good point. He's saying, okay, if we can't talk this out, why do we even have debates like this? Why do we have our thing? And Ivar responds saying that talking is already a matter of force because a strong man does not have to talk to a weak man. They have no need for it because the strong can already impose their beliefs and ideas onto the weak through force. He says that negotiation is dependent on equal strength. They need to both be armed and both be physically strong in order to want to avoid war and thus have a discussion. But Thorfinn responds saying that there are people who are open to conversation so long as you invite them. And then he points over to the tree line here, where we see Bug Eyes arriving with the Gitpi tribe. And we have specifically of interest Polmuk, Misekpikwe, and Nisquajij. Having these three is awesome because we have Polmuk, who has gone a long way to embrace Norse culture. We have Nisquajij, who has her sort of personal connection with Bug Eyes as a friend, and then being split between worlds almost with her, I guess, mentorship, or rather apprenticeship of Misekpikwe, the shaman. And then we have Misek, who is the most, I guess, anti-Norse person in the Ulnu sort of faction within the Ulnu people. So it's very interesting that he is taking part in this specifically because he has the strongest opinions against them. And he actually hasn't gotten to meet them and speak to them yet. That's the most important part. He hasn't been a part of the conversation with them. He's sort of been keeping an eye on them and learning about them through Nisquajij. But Thorfinn says that before they start arming themselves, they need to first have a talk that includes the people they're afraid of. This, like I was saying before, a lot of their arguments depended on the Ulnu being the outsiders they can't predict. Thorfinn knows that they need to be integrated. They need to be seen as more people within their community rather than another community, another faction they need to be worried about. And this is the first resort. And that ends this chapter. It's a very strong ending for this chapter. I absolutely love it. But let's get into the analysis here. So I want to start just by talking about Arnheid again. I brought her up throughout the chapter, and the framing of her statue looking over the debate and how the feelings of women and the opinions of women play into it all. So this chapter makes a significant part of its focus on the differences between men and women in society and how they have sort of different roles, different ideas, different feelings. And it addresses how the pressure to be masculine makes men act in a way that women sort of find nonsensical. And this leads to wars, and women, like Arnheid, are victims of these wars, despite, like Gudrid said, wanting the men to stop fighting, stop playing, and get back to work. Obviously, there's a lot of generalizing here. There will be plenty of pro-war women in this time, but in terms of just general feelings, I don't think it's unfair for Gudrid to represent that idea here. And this is very in line with Arnheid's arc as women who were caught in men's storms, and she had her life destroyed to the point where she no longer had a reason to want to live. And Gudrid has been a woman who wanted to break free of men's society since her introduction, and this chapter really allows her to carry the meaning of Arnheid and her ideals while the statue sort of silently watches over, and I really like that. And while the pressure of masculinity in society is certainly a problem, and one that still exists today, I think Yukimura does a really good job using Stork to show that this isn't the full picture. So let's get into Stork's argument. Sorry for being a cowardly man. So to say that all men are just war-loving idiots would be disingenuous. While there are men like Thorkel who truly do enjoy it and live for it, and I maybe not today to that extent of Thorkel. Thorkel is very much a dramatization of that idea, but it's fair to say that there are some. The common man would be way more in line with Stork's argument here. Especially today, in like modern day, Stork's opinion resonates much stronger with Thorfinn's detractors, the actual readers who don't agree with Thorfinn's ideals. Because it's more of a realist approach to avoiding conflict. The current state of nuclear war, where it's nuclear deterrence, the idea of mutual destruction. This is seen as the sort of way to peace in modern society, and nobody likes war. To some extent, nobody. Obviously, generalizing isn't going to do any good for anyone, but most people nowadays would truly see Stork's argument as valid and sort of resonate with it. And I also think Ivar is more in line with this as well. Most people who are hearing Ivar's sort of brutish speeches about war, they're going to see him as a sort of straw man against the armament idea and see him as emotional and unreasonable. So the readers who don't agree with Thorfinn won't really like Ivar's method here. But even though he has this masculine ego and he's definitely a warrior in the traditional sense, I still think he ultimately is trying to be reasonable and maintain peace. I don't think he's a Thorkel kind of character who wants war, loves war, gets bored without it. He's just sort of so far into his ego and paranoia that he doesn't really frame his arguments correctly. But Stork is essentially able to take the debate because of his admittance of being a coward. Like Thorfinn, he is going against warrior culture here by saying he's a coward, but in a way that is not sort of idealistic and as they might think unreasonable, like Thorfinn. And this argument is going to work a lot better with the other men who came on this expedition, because again, they are people who were pushed all the way to Iceland, to Greenland. They are already trying to escape war to some extent. And if they came here with the idea of creating a nation without war, without slavery, they're not warriors looking to find glory in death and reach Valhalla. These are not people like traditional Viking warriors. These are average people who are trying to avoid oppression and create a land of peace. And this sort of reminds me a lot of Omar's arc, where it's not about a love of war that made him fail to be a true warrior. He wasn't super excited to go to war because he loves it like Thorgil. Omar was a coward, and he was too much of a coward to have the real strength and resolve to be a true warrior, to, like he said, allow himself to be mocked, like he talks about at the end of the farm arc when he decides to surrender. He was a mentally weak, not physically weak person. and he didn't love war. He didn't want to kill people. He wanted to be respected. He wanted to be seen as strong. So that sort of idea of cowardice being what keeps him from being a true warrior, rather than that actual warrior mentality, the Viking mentality, is very much in line with how the average settler here seems to be feeling. But all of the debates aside, there is one more part of this analysis I want to talk about, and this is sort of a bit of a touchy subject here, but I have some pretty, at this point, minor but could be major concerns with Cordelia. So a big part of this chapter was the build up to Cordelia's reveal of the sword. And this moment was incredible. The process of getting there is what has me be a little bit concerned with where her arc is going. So the chapter began with Cordelia thinking of her father telling her that she was born a man, and then her thinking back to times of the battlefield where she didn't want to fight. And what sparks her resolve to reveal the sword was Gudrid saying that men don't have to fight, and Gudrid using Thorfinn as an example of the kind of man that Vinland needs. And I'll go back to this here. When Cordelia asks if man really doesn't have to fight, if men don't have to go to war, we have Thorfinn respond by asking her to stay herself and hate war. And no use of pronouns here. He specifically says, please stay yourself, Cordelia, hating war like you do. This is not reaffirming anything about gender here. This is Thorfinn simply saying, be yourself and keep hating war like you do. So this all seems to imply not that Cordelia is a woman, but that she is a man who does not want to engage in the traditional masculinity that society expects of her. And this could potentially mean her arc will lead to her living as a man worthy of Vinland, rather than finding a place where she can be respected as a woman. I don't see that going over well with many people who have enjoyed her as a representation of being trans, because this idea of her learning that a man doesn't need to be super masculine like society expects of her, and that potentially learning that she isn't a woman, she's just a man who doesn't want to engage in society as a man is expected to. And this makes her seem like be presented as being confused now, rather than being someone who's sure of who they are and how they want to live. So I'm very hesitant with Cordelia, and I'm a bit concerned about where that's going. I don't think that Yukimura is, transphobic or anything like that. But already, Cordelia is not a character who has a traditional sort of trans experience. She was raised as a girl by her mother. And currently, she wants to be referred to as a woman, wants to be treated as a woman. So I have no problem using she, her pronouns for Cordelia here, and I think everybody should respect how Cordelia feels. But if this goes in the direction of her sort of being a man worthy of Vinland rather than being respected as a woman, I don't know if that's going to go over well, and I don't think I would be very happy with it either, because I like Cordelia as herself. So that one we'll have to kind of wait and see. I'm not too sure how that's going to be treated, but this chapter does sort of start to insinuate this idea that Cordelia simply believed men had to be a specific thing, so thought she had to be a woman instead, and potentially will come to believe that she doesn't need to be a woman anymore. So we'll have to see how Yukimura takes that, I guess. But let's let's start wrapping up here and just kind of get to my overall thoughts with the chapter. So my expectations were mostly on point, but like I said before, I did make predictions that would more so come into play at the end of this debate rather than the middle point where this chapter went up to. But still, overall, the debate aspect I think was handled incredibly well. Both sides made good points and also made bad points, and they were arguing with logic, but also kind of falling into their emotions a little bit. So this made neither side feel like a straw man, and the perspectives they end up expressing do feel very genuine, human, and just understandable. And the way Yukimura uses Stork is incredibly just great. He's used as a more sensible and understandable antagonist that represents the pro-armament perspective, but also falls more in line with what the average reader who disagrees with Thorfinn would be thinking. And that's a much needed thing to sort of counteract Ivar's almost cartoonish sort of masculinity that he tries to throw up, and his ego. And this makes the chapter feel incredibly respectful of both sides and shows a lot of humility in Yukimura as an author, who ultimately wants to show the reader why we should be on Thorfinn's side. He's still willing to give the arguments that make sense for both sides, and I like that a lot. I especially liked Thorfinn's reaction to the sword here. This was a really great moment. It perfectly shows how serious it is for him by completely shifting him off this agreeability he's been having in these debates and having him just get more assertive and aggressive with how he sort of demands this sword. He says no excuses. And the decision to bring the Ulnu people in at the end, bring in the Gitpi tribe with all these really important voices, is perfect. Bring them into the conversation rather than having this debate only sort of consist of the settlers internally is exactly what needs to be done in order for effective communication, to reassure the settlers who admitted to being cowards here. And this also presents potential dangers of miscommunication because of the limitation in language, especially if the debate gets heated, like we talked about in the chapter Nisquaji's Expedition, where we see how communication gets dismantled. We see if things get loud, things get aggressive, where tone is saying a lot more than the words, then that leads to miscommunication and confusion. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how the Ulnu are going to be used next chapter, and that sort of leads into my predictions here. So if this chapter was made to show the result of an isolated conversation that allows fear to brew, next chapter will be made to show why both sides need to be involved when trying to resolve peace. I think Ivar's growing aggression here, though, will lead to something bad happening near the sort of climax of the debate. The sword is officially in the open and known now, and honestly, I don't think the thing will end without it being used at this point. now that it is sort of in play. So I think we'll potentially see the debate change to be in Thorfinn's favor now that the Ulnu are able to join the conversation and reassure the settlers that they also want peace. And based on how Ivar acts this chapter, it isn't likely that it isn't unlikely that he could resort to strength to take control, since a strong man does not need to talk to a weak man. He might think that he could just show his strength in order to get his way, and we might have to have Thorfinn take control of that situation, which could be very interesting. Ultimately, I think we'll reach a point where it seems like things could be going the right direction before one mistake ruins it and Yukimura pulls out that comfort once again and that building tension sort of boiling over. But like I said before, I'm also really excited to see what Misekwe will do in this upcoming conversation as the biggest detractor of the Norse from the Ilnu side. I imagine he will have some of the more important words to say here and will bring some very necessary conflict from the Ilnu side. And it's really, really, really great that he's being involved here and he's not just sort of playing telephone with Nisquazish about what the intentions of the Norse are. And this could also lead to him bringing up the prophecy in the debate, and that will have a huge impact on how a lot of people will feel about this story based on how that's treated and how Thorfinn and the other settlers react to that information. But that's going to be it for my review and analysis here. I'm really looking forward to next chapter, and I want to see what the Ulnu will sort of bring to the table and how they will shift the debate. But that's gonna have to wait till next month. So until then, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.